All right, I got a book report for you. The Beauty of Games by Frank Lantz. A short book, like 150 pages. It is so good. It is, I think, my favorite book I've ever read about games. I haven't read that many, but this one really knocked my socks off. And it gives this kind of like grand unifying theory idea of what games are that really got me. And it really like hit the nail on the head in a way that I haven't had this experience before. And I was just like, I was really moved by it. I can't stop thinking about it. And so I'm just going to talk about some of the ideas that I found so interesting. So there's this old kind of boring debate about whether games are art. And I've never really found this to be a particularly interesting conversation. It's like pretty thorny because like people have like a really specific idea of what art is, or maybe they have an incredibly vague idea of what art is. And it has always felt to me like it was just sort of a proxy conversation for really saying like, should we take games seriously? Because like, oh, if they're art, we take them seriously. And if they're not art, we don't take them seriously. And so we use this as this like weird proxy for talking about whether or not games matter. And if you have this like really big and inclusive idea of what art is, like, oh, Duchamp bringing a toilet into an art gallery, that's art, and a beautiful website, that's art. Then, like, of course, games are art. There's not really much of a conversation to be had there. And then there's this other kind of way of thinking about it, which is like, well, art is this sort of like the romantic concept of art is this like transcendent and important and beautiful and static thing that like when the viewer or consumer or whatever takes it in, they are elevated to a higher plane of existence and sort of transcended out of their day-to-day grind, and they're taken to a timeless place. And that's a beautiful idea. That's kind of what Roger Ebert says. It's like why games are not art is because like games are about toil and work and I think he said basically like I don't rule out the idea that a game could eventually be art, but all the ones that I've seen are effectively kitsch. They're not that. It's a thorny and frustrating argument that a lot of people get really mad about. I think it's like kind of interesting to think about. I don't really feel too strongly about it, but the point is that whole conversation is like not the most interesting to me. What is interesting is what Lance does, which is that in this first chapter of this book, he basically says, I want to sidestep that entire conversation and not get into that thorny conversation. And instead, I'll talk about something much less controversial, which is that whether or not they're art, they're clearly aesthetic. And there's a way to interpret them aesthetically. And all aesthetic forms, whether it's music or film or books or games, they range from like shallow to deep, to from silly to serious, from kitsch to transcendent, right? All aesthetic forms have an extremely broad range, and that's completely okay. We have no problem with that. The culinary arts go from junk food to five-star cuisine, and that's okay, right? So the much more interesting question is, given that games are an aesthetic form, what are their aesthetics and how do we talk about them? Right. So the aesthetics of music is like an aesthetics of listening. The aesthetics of visual art is an aesthetics of seeing. But he makes this argument that games are really an aesthetics of thinking, right? Games present us with these novel problems, and they say, go use your reasoning to kind of reason your way through them and think your way out of them. And good games draw attention back to the thought itself, because you have to come up with a mental model, and then you have to test it and implement it and see how well you did, and then you need to update it. And it draws your attention back to your own thinking. And there's not a lot of parts of life that do this for us in such a safe and interesting and fun environment. And this is where the beauty of games really comes to life. He keeps on using this phrase. It's that games are like thought made visible to itself, which is a really interesting idea. And so a lot of times when we talk about the aesthetics of games, we're drawn to talking about sound and visuals and technology in video games, or the actual art, what it looked like if it's a board game, like the tactile feel of it. All valid, but I think that they are ultimately sort of like secondary or tertiary to the main thing, which is that it's an aesthetics of thinking. he goes into this really long and super interesting example where he talks about Go and he talks about poker, two games that basically don't have a strong visual style. They are not games about visual art, certainly not about technology or sound. They are tactile, yes, but again, it's kind of secondary to the main thing, which is that you're thinking. And there's no story present in these games really at all. They're almost completely abstract. And so, like what poker does, for example, is it gives you these mechanisms, it gives you probabilities, and it gives you these kind of really simple rules to go understand without much of a sort of like obvious aesthetic flair to it. And if you don't know the rules of poker and you're watching it, you're thinking, this is the most boring thing in the world. But of course, we know poker makes great TV. It's a massive enterprise of like professional poker. So, what makes it so fun and interesting to watch? And his answer is that it's really about deep thinking and thinking about thought. Like when you play poker, you have to come up with a mental model. You have to do a lot of like calculations and you have to come in with a strategy. There's meta strategies that evolve over time, but you are also trying to not be too predictable. And so you need to jump between strategies, between mental models to remain a little bit unpredictable because people are trying to read you just as you're trying to read them and trying to understand what is the strategy that they're playing with or the strategies that they are bouncing between. And you get like layers and layers up into this very like dense forest of thought that is incredibly complicated and incredibly rich. This is the aesthetics of poker, is thinking about poker and thinking about thinking about poker and thinking about what your opponents are doing. It's very, very interesting. And most other aesthetic forms don't give this to us. And it's part of what makes games so interesting and weird. Another thing that makes it so interesting and weird is he talks about this concept of instrumental reasoning, which is a term I had never heard before, but it's kind of the idea of like using your reasoning to achieve a specific purpose. This has like mixed bags because it's not sort of like a pure reasoning like you might try to do in philosophy. It's like a motivated reasoning. That's another kind of nasty term in the behavioral psychology world, but it's like this motivated reasoning to go like do something, to like maximize profit, to come up with a new law or something like that. You were trying to achieve an end with your reasoning. And this helps us to kind of tease out another part of what makes games so weird and unique is that in one sense, that's what games are, right? The game designer gives you some sort of objective, some sort of problem to solve, and you have to go use your reasoning to solve that thing. And so in a way, it's sort of like we're practicing instrumental reasoning. But at the same time, games are really not for profit. They don't matter. They have almost no consequence on the outside world. And so in a way, it's almost like we're like cosplaying instrumental reason, right? We get to go play Monopoly and act monopolistically. We get to play a war game and fight each other and kill and use our reasoning to like enact vengeance and to solve problems and be ruthless and play these roles that we don't play in real life. And so he calls this as sort of this like double gesture where we are doing instrumental reasoning, but also we're actually stepping fully outside of real life to go into the sort of magic circle of game playing. And this is part of what makes games so strange and really different from any other aesthetic form that I can think of. So why does any of this matter? I've always kind of thought of like game design as like you're designing problems. You know, it's very different from like product management, the thing that I do day to day, which is about solving problems, is that in game design, what you're really trying to do is present an interesting problem, communicate or pose an interesting problem to the player. And I think this is really an interesting way of thinking about that. It's really illuminating to think about how do I present an interesting problem to a player that is approachable, that's simple enough to like wrap your head around initially so you can get started, but is also so novel and interesting that it actually causes them to think in new ways and new and uncomfortable ways where they haven't thought, they haven't seen a problem that is exactly this shape before, and they have to pause and think and notice their own thinking. That is the aesthetic experience that I want my players to have. And that's really blowing my mind. And I had a ton of fun reading this. You should go out and buy it. If any of those ideas were interesting to you, they were explained much, much better in The Beauty of Games by Frank Lantz.